Alrighty, so here we are at week 3, Learn Together. And before I start into week 3, a few comments about week 2. I know that in the video, and I laugh because I talked about how it was even hard for me to share code because I wanted to do it more efficiently. And as I reflected and looked back at the code, it was really more about what I saw several other students who have more advanced skill is that when you, and this is what I had asked students to do, limit yourself to only the code that we've learned so far in Andrew's course, it's actually a little bit challenging, right? But it's, I think, good exercise to do it. So here's what I've kind of, I would say, evolved a little bit on this one. And then I have talked about this in here, but the idea here is that we're basically taking, and I think a pretty good roadmap is at the end of section 3, his grade calculator, right? But also keep that in mind and then take the code that you wrote for week 2 and then refactor. So this is a term we often hear is when you refactor code, is restructuring your existing code. But what I want to ask you to do is actually place it in a new file. I'll show you what I did in mine, just as far as the file names go, and you can see the link as well, and that I will provide in the replies. But I ended up calling, and I think this is good, keep it a base name of whatever it is, week 1 and then week 2, and then don't simply, if you can, copy and paste the code that you wrote for one week to the other, rewrite it, because that's part of the process because it makes you rethink it. And I'll go over my code in a minute. But what I've said is if you absolutely want to use something outside of the scope and if you want full points, then just provide your fellow students some written description of the code that you're using. And I did at the beginning of this, but I need to do a better job as well. But if all possible, limit yourself to the code that we are using in those sections, because I think it's helpful for the students that are just really beginning here, which, by the way, this is really a beginner's course. So we want to focus our attention on everyone, and specifically those that have little or no programming experience. So when you, the more advanced students, write code that is focused on the section or the section, so at this point, section 1, 2, 3, or 4, actually this should say 4, right? Because week 3, yeah, it'd be 4. So I'll change that. But anyway, it really gives them, they should be able to more easily read the code that you write and see the logic that you've used as far as the way you've organized your code. So we're all teachers is my point about that. So I'll go over my code in a minute. But part 2 of this, and I've given you an or you can do both, is I drafted the requirements for Dev 1. And I want you to read over them because I definitely think they could be refactored. Again, this word, refactor, and it is right here in our 5th week, right? So remember, this accounts for 25% of your grade. And I've just drafted some requirements, right? So I've said we're going to use coding style and program functionality we've learned. And coding style really means, right, the way he writes functions, the way he does a camel case, right? That's his style, and pretty general style, so it's good, and we adopt that when we're working in this class, right? Simulate user input, you see that already, and I'll show you how I've done it, and most people I've seen have done this, but right now, because we're not working on the browser, you're going to have user input, and you can either do this in global variables or arrays and objects, which we're going to learn in the coming weeks, and maybe some program settings in global variables as well. I meant global variables there. And this is where I'm like, I don't know if I want to say a minimum. So, this is your feedback is good. A minimum of 4 functions that handle return values or methods, which you don't, if you've not done any programming, you're not familiar with that. We're going to learn about methods when we get to objects. So the method will do the same as your functions, just called differently, but also encapsulated in an object. Use template strings for output. At this point, I would recommend we all use template strings just because I think it really signals a more current JavaScript. And so I think it's better to use unless you absolutely have a reason. And then for output, and update user input. So you're providing the output, your program is processing, and then you have you're simulating user input, you're doing process, and then you're simulating the output. So you've updated that output with what we call, this is a term you're going to hear, non-persistent data. That's because every time you run it, because we're not saving it, something we will do later, it changes each time. Okay, and then I've just done a few bullet points here about where you'd put your code, but again, as in the next couple weeks, we can talk more about that. And schedule a date and time at least 24 hours in advance. I will have the reservation link up probably maybe this week or the first of next. And submit your code before your appointment. Now, if you're doing appointments after the due date, obviously you have to have already submitted those. And then during the review, I will run the code. Yes, it must work for you to get all the points. And test different inputs and discuss the code that you wrote. And your code will account for 25% of your grade. I said this already. Let me circle back around to a piece that I didn't cover, I realize, is that what I'm saying here, and this is probably any part of this you want to give me either questions or feedback about is great, but creating code that you can explain, from all the things I've mentioned here is 75%. And then 25% will come from implementing new objects or array methods, or you could, talk to me about some other code that you'd want to include. So this base code, right? So if you're going for that 75%, which I recommend everybody go beyond, but it would include all those things that we've learned with your own programming select tactic, right? But in this case, you will need to go beyond the scope of what we've learned. That's really where we start to stretch ourselves and learn something new. Okay. Anyway, this is a draft, just FYI. Okay, let me come back over here. And then I've also said I've given you an or if you don't have anything right now you can think of. And I think this would be good to do anyway. But, being a productive coder often, not always, but means, that the editor, there's definitely things in the editor that can make you a better programmer. And I know Jared's been great about putting out some of these already. But if there's things as a senior developer that you're finding, or a senior coder, right? So one I use a lot is and I could use the keyboard shortcut here. I actually switch between Linux and my Mac, so I'm actually not great about using the keyboard because it's a little different. But formatting selection is a big one for me, right? And then using the shift to do multiple selection. And there's also another one for line selection. So when you have code that is similar and all you're doing is changing on multiple lines, that's another one I use quite a bit. And then, of course, for those of you I recommend the command line when doing your Git workflow, but there is, of course, the built-in nice, simple way to do it through VS Code. So I'm just going to tell you, that's another way to do Git, but I would not do that until you get used to the command line. So anyway, throw out some of, if you have, and I've said 3 here, but actually since I'm doing or, because I did that after, I would say, at least a couple, right? And again, it's an or an and if you'd like. All right, so let me just show you what I did. And now, by the way, what we're doing here for the most part is refactoring code. So I'm going to show you what I did this is my refactor of this. Of course, I still set up some, this is the user. So now actually for mine and my user input, I ended up doing random selections, but I did set up some game statistics. So I set the player. And then I got the random, I selected a random integer between 0 and 2. So rock, scissors, paper, right? 3 selections. And then, and by the way, I also, and this is important, if your code was inspired, you got some of it and you modified it. And definitely if you used it exactly, when we go to code review, I wouldn't count that, but anyway, we'll have to have a talk about that. But for sure, at a minimum, what you would want to do is tell me where you got that. So this was inspired by Mozilla MDM network, and I refactored it for my own purposes. And then what I decided to do was write another function where I converted to rock, scissors, paper by sending this, and I'll show you in a minute how I called kind of from what we call a bottom-up perspective, right? So depending on what came from running the random integer. Now I could have actually done this in the same function, but I decided I wanted to break it out. And then I rewrote and I called it get RPS results. And I rewrote this to be more efficient, to where if the player selects rock and if the game selects scissors, then of course, right, so rock beats scissors, right? Else, so in this case, the else would be they didn't select rock, they selected paper, right? So I just made it a bit more efficient. And I rewrote this and then found some other places online, but this was actually my code, the way I rewrote it. So it just made it more efficient. So instead of all those if statements that I had in here for that first week, if else, I ended up rewriting this more efficiently. Something we could talk about, at least to give you a reference, and it's really about writing efficient code, the big O. Something we could give you a video on to help you understand. And then what I did is I wrote another function, which, by the way, I just did returns of a string on here, and I did I incremented. That's actually something I do have to document because I don't think we've talked about that here. So I'll need to document that in my code. Okay, so in this case, I also had a function for my game output so that I could call it each time. And then I decided to do kind of two little helper functions that actually would go and get the random selection for the player and then do a return by converting to the rock, scissors, paper based on that. And I did that for both the game and the player in the game. And then the first time I played the game, I set up the variables for player choice. And then the third time on, all I'd had to do, and that's why I did it, is I just copied that same code. So the reason I did it this way is you've heard this term, and if you haven't heard it, and I believe he talks about it, called dry. Dry in programming is the idea of do not repeat yourself. Now, the only time in my case I'm repeating myself is because I'm simulating the idea of the user playing, so there's no way. There probably is a way. I should think about that. Actually, I could. And that's part of what is fun about this, is you create something and you look at it and you're like, I could do a better job. So in this case, do not repeat yourself dry. The dry principle is very, very important, right? In programming, there may be times that you have to, but you really try not to repeat yourself when you're writing code. That's part of course, the benefit of writing functions, right? Is that. So one of the things I didn't do here, because I think I was trying to figure out how I could do it, but I set default values. So I'd have to think about that in the context of my game to see if I'd want to do that. So let me just play it for you just so you can see, because it was totally fun to play for me, right? So I have at the end of each game, that is one thing, I put a new line at the end of each game. So what I did, tie, right? So shouldn't have been one there. I just realized. Anyway, it's funny as you look at your output, you're like, that doesn't make sense. So scissors cuts rock, so player wins. I get to add to my total, right? Played total 2. Oh yeah, so I'm sorry, that was right. I played a total of 1 time, and this is my second play. I've won once, so I'm winning 50% of the time. The game's not. There's another tie, right? So then total count of games, and then the last time the game wins. So it's kind of fun. It's kind of fun for me too, because I'm randomly selecting both the user input and the game, the user selection and the game selection. And it's really kind of fun to do that. And actually, one thing I need to do is be more consistent. So maybe where it says get player selection, maybe I should have said player selection instead of player choice there. But remember also, it's really helpful when you're naming your variables and your functions. The more descriptive you are, the more readable your code is. Anyway, hope that helps you out. The last thing I want to say, and it's just a heads up that, and I know it may seem like forever from now, but it's not. The end of the semester, all of our code reviews have to be done by the 10th of October. And so I mentioned this before, but this class, and actually it should be developed at 2. Actually it is. 5's hanging out there. I got to get rid of that. But that code review is compressed to that week, or maybe the 2 days the week after, just because honestly, class ends here, but I'm traveling this day, heading to Austin for a couple of days for a Google event I'm helping run. Okay, I talked about DevFest. I will have, actually I'll talk about that in the attendance this week, so I'll hold that for then. All right, have a great one, and talk to you soon.